Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I've always loved driving at night. There's something peaceful about the open road, miles of dark highway stretching into oblivion. The headlights cast just enough light to see a few hundred feet ahead, the world beyond swallowed by shadows. It's just me, the hum of the engine, and the endless black. I never expected anything more. This time, though, something was different. I was hauling a long-distance load from Texas to Nevada, a routine route I've driven 100 times before. The skies were clear, the air crisp, and the roads relatively empty. It was around 2 a.m., and my favorite late-night radio show had just signed off. I found myself flipping through static-filled stations, trying to find something, anything, to fill the silence. That's when I saw the figure. A man was standing on the side of the road, arm extended, thumb up. His clothes were disheveled, and his face looked pale in the glow of my headlights. His eyes met mine for a split second as I passed him, and I couldn't shake the feeling of something being off. People don't hitchhike in the middle of the desert, especially not at this hour. The odd thing was, he didn't look surprised when I passed by him. He just watched. My gut told me to keep going, and I did, but the image of his face stayed with me, haunting me as I continued driving. I shook off the feeling and pressed on. After a few miles, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:23 a.m. I yawned, the fatigue creeping in. The road stretched on, desolate and barren. Just as I was considering pulling over for a quick nap, I saw him again. The hitchhiker. Standing in the exact same pose, arm extended, thumb out, only this time his face was turned away from the road. What the hell? I muttered under my breath. I'm not a superstitious guy, but my hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as I drove past him. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't even look in my direction. It was as if he knew I was coming and didn't care. As I put more distance between us, I felt a heavy weight settle in my chest. This was impossible. I was miles from where I first saw him, and there were no cars or side roads. No one could have gotten ahead of me on foot. Yet there he was. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I kept my eyes on the road, focusing hard, trying to make sense of it. My heartbeat had finally slowed down when the figure appeared again, this time right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a halt mere feet from him. My headlights illuminated every detail. His face was emotionless, eyes hollow. His skin, pale and almost translucent, seemed to reflect the light in an unnatural way. He stood perfectly still, staring at me through the windshield, unblinking. I cursed under my breath, not sure what to do. There was no sign of any other vehicles, no way he could have gotten in front of me. But he was there, blocking my path. I considered backing up, finding a detour, but something inside me told me that wouldn't work. The road was empty. This was the only way through. Taking a deep breath, I honked the horn, hoping he'd step aside. He didn't flinch. That's when I noticed it. His eyes weren't looking at me, they were looking past me into the cab of my truck. I instinctively turned my head, peering into the shadows of the back seat. Nothing. But the air felt heavy, thick, as if someone was there, someone I couldn't see. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I turned back to the road, and the hitchhiker was gone. Just vanished. The highway ahead was empty again, stretching into the void. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was tired, or maybe the dark was playing tricks on me. I pressed the gas pedal lightly, creeping forward. That's when I heard it. A low, soft whisper coming from behind me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakable. Someone, or something. One was in my truck. Heart racing, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing but the dimly lit cab stared back at me. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't alone. Suddenly the hitchhiker appeared again, this time in the mirror. But he wasn't outside. He was inside, sitting in the back seat, his cold, empty eyes staring straight at me. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, paralyzed with fear. "Let me out." The words finally came, soft, chilling. I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that I floored the gas pedal, my truck roaring as it sped down the empty highway. The hitchhiker was gone again, but the feeling that he was inside with me lingered, an invisible presence haunting the cab. The whispers hadn't stopped, though. They grew louder, more aggressive, filling the air until they were all I could hear. My head pounded, and I felt a suffocating dread clawing at me. I turned up the radio, trying to drown them out, but it didn't help. The road seemed endless. Every mile felt like an eternity. I kept driving, desperate to escape whatever was haunting me, praying I'd reach the next town soon. And then, just like that, the whispers stopped. The air cleared, and the tension lifted as if whatever had been there had left. I pulled into a gas station at the edge of a small town, my hands still trembling as I stepped out of the truck. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. I walked into the gas station, hoping to shake off the unease. The attendant glanced at me as I approached the counter, his eyes narrowing. "You okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. Instead, I just nodded and asked for a cup of coffee. As I took my first sip, I heard it again. That soft, low whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from the cab of my truck. I never drove at night again. House sitting has been a constant in my life for as long as I can remember. The exact moment I started is a bit foggy. It likely began with looking after the homes of friends, parents, and acquaintances. Over time, what was once a casual favor evolved into one of my primary sources of income. Throughout my house-sitting career, I've encountered some unusual situations, mostly amusing, though a few have been unsettling. These experiences were typically minor inconveniences involving quirky homeowners. With time, I honed my instincts and became adept at spotting potential issues before they escalated. But nothing could have prepared me for this particular job. The house belonged to an older, childless couple who owned 3 properties. They seemed incredibly kind, and during our interview, I felt confident that this was the perfect assignment. You know how in crime documentaries people often say there were no warning signs, that it was completely out of the blue? I used to be skeptical of those claims, always thinking the signs were there and folks just missed them. But after what I went through, I'm not so quick to judge anymore. The job was simple: take care of a country house for 2 months. The couple rotated between their 3 homes, and the country house had supposedly been vandalized a few times. Nothing major, just some exterior graffiti. No one had ever tried to break in. My main task was to keep an eye out and scare off any troublemakers. Before we go further, there's something important you should know about me. After years of house sitting, I developed partnerships with home security companies. It was a side gig where I'd sometimes earn money by recommending home alarm systems to homeowners or testing out products. For a few months, I'd been testing a portable security camera that was easy to set up and take down. I liked it so much that I bought one for myself. Whenever I stayed at a more isolated house for more than 3 days, I'd bring the camera along. It took about 30 minutes to install, and once it was up and running, I could access the footage on my phone. So, since I was going to be at this house for 2 months, I made sure to bring the camera with me. The house was drop-dead gorgeous. I remember feeling a twinge of envy the moment I saw it. I could barely afford a tiny apartment, and here was this couple with 3 homes, one more beautiful than the next. This particular house was situated between the sea and a wooded area, a kind of mini forest that led to the rest of the town. The house was wooden, and in the back, facing the forest, there was a perfect table for having breakfast. Also in this back area was a small storage shed, adorable just like the main house, at least adorable on the outside. But we all know appearances can be deceiving. After the envy passed, I felt happy. The house had more than enough amenities, and the pay was excellent. I was going to have a mega vacation there and get paid for it. Once again, little did I know how wrong I was. Inside, the house was just as beautiful. It had a spacious living room with a sofa, a fireplace, and a sort of bar that led into the kitchen. The only downside was that it was in a no-service area, so before heading there, I downloaded a ton of movies and filled my suitcase with books. The first day was perfect. I set up the camera, did some general shopping, and explored the house's nooks and crannies. I had been warned that there were a few places I couldn't enter: the outbuildings, outside the master bedroom, and the basement. I found that completely understandable. They could be places with more personal items, and understandably, they didn't want me snooping around and touching what wasn't mine. After dinner, I checked the camera. Everything was calm, so I decided to put on a movie and relax. I woke up in the middle of the night with a light intermittently hitting my face. You know when your watch catches the daylight and reflects it onto your face or the ceiling? It was exactly that sensation. I peeked out the window and saw a boat on the coast. The house was right by a beach with a small port, and anchored at the very beginning was a super old boat. It was so old I would have thought it abandoned if it weren't for the light reflecting from one of the windows. I found it strange, so I immediately closed the blind, confirmed everything was locked, and went to the room where I would be staying. The next day, feeling rejuvenated, I got up early, had breakfast, and went to the beach. I wanted to get a better look at the boat and try to figure out if it was abandoned or not. Seeing it up close, I had no doubts. It was impossible for anyone to be living there. The boat was falling apart, and there was no movement from inside. More at ease and completely dismissing what I had seen, I spent the rest of the day relaxing on the beach. That night, I felt a slight discomfort, hearing what sounded like a scream coming from the wooded area. It sounded like a person, but at the same time, it sounded like a recording of someone screaming, almost as if they were playing a movie. The house was isolated from the other houses in the town, but not so isolated that I would be the only one to hear that. I stepped outside to try and understand better what it could be. I was still at the front door when I smelled cigarette smoke. Something instinctive told me to shut the door immediately. I even thought I was imagining things, but the next day, I found a stubbed-out cigarette on the table at the back of the house. I had had breakfast at that table that morning, so I was absolutely sure that cigarette had been left there later. I felt genuinely uncomfortable, but the truth is, the couple had warned me the house was sometimes vandalized on the exterior, and that was precisely why I was there, to scare away potential vandals. I calmed myself by saying they were just rebellious teenagers. For the next 10 days, I lived in a strange state. I almost always had the feeling of being watched, or rather the house being watched. But I couldn't tell if the person watching the house lived on the boat or in the surrounding forest. I decided to go to the nearest gas station where there was cell service and call the owner to explain my discomfort, but both had their phones turned off. On the 13th day, I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud noise. I couldn't tell what it was, but it seemed to come from outside the house. I peeked out the window and saw the storage shed's window broken. Luckily, the previous night, I had been watching videos about home invasions, and one of the most used tactics was creating distractions like that. The goal was to get people to open the front door. Instead of doing that, I decided to check the security camera, but I didn't see anyone. Then I heard a noise coming from the front of the house. I was genuinely scared. The owners had told me no one had ever tried to break in, but were they trying now? I ran around the house to make sure not only all the windows and doors were locked, but also all the blinds were drawn. Then the power went out. I was starting to get genuinely alarmed and even considered running to my car and getting out of there as fast as I could. But I didn't know what awaited me outside. Whoever it was had already noticed the installed camera and was clearly avoiding it. For the first few hours I used my phone's flashlight, but when I saw the battery was running low, I had to find a new flashlight. I had searched all the rooms without success when I thought it was probably in the basement. Access was restricted and locked. But oh well, it was an emergency, and surely the owners would understand why I had gone in there. I quickly fetched a kitchen knife and set to work. Undoubtedly, another skill I had picked up over those years of house-sitting was the ability to open any door. When I finally managed and got inside, I felt chills. Not that I had an immediate reason for it, but it was like a strange energy hit me. I could see little, but it was a small room with just a table and a bookshelf. A bit odd for a basement. On the table was an open book, and when I got closer, I realized it was about medieval torture instruments. Then I looked at the bookshelf and realized they were all more or less the same kind of books. About torture instruments, about death, about ways bodies decompose, about suffering. It sent chills down my spine. Who the hell were these people, and what kind of morbid tastes did they have? For the first time, I doubted them. Then, inspecting the bookshelf more closely, I noticed there were diaries in one corner. Lots of diaries. The oldest one was 27 years old and had 1997 inscribed on the cover. I took them out and began to see what they contained. I can't even describe what I felt during the next hour and a half as I frantically read through passages of those diaries. The couple who had hired me were sick, completely sick. The diaries were records of the crimes they had committed. Every year, they hired someone like me to take care of that house for 2 months, and during that time, they terrorized the person until they broke, and they managed to get into the house. Of all the diaries I had read, none of the people had survived. It was a sick game, and I was right in the middle of it. They lived on the boat during that time, and every night they created different distractions. Not only was it, I stood there in the basement, my heart pounding in my chest as the horrifying realization set in. The couple had been playing with their house sitters, manipulating them, pushing them to their breaking point until they ultimately fell victim to the twisted game. I was next in line, and they were already several moves ahead. I shoved the diaries back onto the shelf and turned to leave when I heard something, footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. They were in the house. I needed to think fast. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call for help, but I remembered I had no service out here. I was completely cut off. I glanced around the basement, looking for anything I could use as a weapon or an escape route, but the room was sealed tight, with only the door as an exit. I heard a faint creak above, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door opening. They were searching the house, looking for me. I had no choice. I had to confront them or find a way out. Gripping the kitchen knife tighter, I moved silently back to the basement door and listened carefully. The footsteps had moved further away, possibly towards the living room. I crept up the stairs, taking each step as slowly and quietly as possible. The power was still out and the house was pitch black, but I had the advantage of knowing its layout better than they did, or so I hoped. As I reached the top of the stairs, I peered through the crack in the door and saw the faint outline of someone moving in the darkness. It was the husband, and he was heading towards the kitchen. I carefully opened the door just enough to slip through and then closed it softly behind me. I could hear the faint sound of the wife's voice whispering something from another room. They were coordinating, trying to corner me. I had to think, fast. The front door was out of the question. They'd see me coming a mile away. The back door leading to the wooded area was my best bet, but it was right near the kitchen where the husband was. I decided to try a different approach. I made my way to the room where the security camera's footage was stored. Maybe I could use it to my advantage, trick them into thinking I was somewhere I wasn't. I reached the small office where the camera system was set up. The screen was dark, but the system was still recording. I quickly rewound the footage and played back the last few minutes. Sure enough, I saw the husband disabling the camera outside, which was why I hadn't seen him approach earlier. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, but that also meant they were relying on memory to find me now. I paused the footage and turned off the screen, plunging the room back into darkness. Taking a deep breath, I made my way back out into the hallway. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing in the quiet house. I could hear them whispering to each other, their voices low but full of intent. I had to move quickly. I headed toward the living room, intending to circle back to the kitchen and make a run for the back door. But as I passed by one of the side windows, something caught my eye. There was movement outside, near the shed. I squinted through the darkness and realized there were people out there, 2 figures, lurking just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the couple, they had help. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I was outnumbered, out of options, and time was running out. The only chance I had was to outsmart them, use their own tactics against them. I quietly opened the nearest window and slipped outside, sticking close to the wall of the house. The night air was cool, and the faint scent of salt from the sea filled my nostrils. I kept low, moving silently towards the back of the house where I could see the shed and the 2 figures more clearly now. They were watching the house, waiting for a signal from inside. As I got closer, I realized the 2 figures weren't moving. They were mannequins dressed in dark clothing, positioned to look like people. It was another sick trick, designed to scare me, to make me feel even more trapped. But this time, it worked in my favor. They thought they had the upper hand, but they didn't know I was outside. I used the cover of darkness to slip past the shed and into the tree line. The forest was dense, the trees casting long shadows that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I needed to get to the nearest house, the nearest phone, anything to call for help. The underbrush crackled beneath my feet, and I had to force myself to slow down, to stay quiet. The house was getting smaller in the distance, and I could hear the faint sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore. But then, I heard something else. Footsteps, fast and heavy, coming up from behind me. They had realized I was gone. Panic surged through me, and I pushed myself to run faster. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and my legs burned with the effort, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear them now, their voices shouting to each other as they closed the distance. The forest thinned out ahead, and I saw the faint outline of a small house, its windows dark. I sprinted towards it, praying that someone was home, that there was a phone or some way to call for help. But as I reached the front door and pounded on it, I realized with a sinking heart that the house was abandoned, just another empty building in this isolated stretch of land. I had no choice. I forced the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. I could hear them outside, their footsteps getting closer, their voices low and menacing. I backed away from the door, searching the dark room for anything I could use to defend myself. In the corner, I saw an old fireplace poker, rusted and covered in dust. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I grabbed it and positioned myself behind the door, my heart racing as I waited for them to break in. The door shook as they tried the handle, finding it locked. Then came the sound of wood splintering as they kicked it in. The door flew open, and the husband stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "You didn't think you could get away that easily, did you?" he sneered, stepping inside. I didn't wait. I swung the poker with all my strength, catching him off guard. The metal connected with his arm, and he let out a pained shout, stumbling back. But I didn't stop there. I swung again and again, driving him back towards the door. But then I felt a sharp pain in my side, and I gasped, dropping the poker. The wife had slipped in behind me and stabbed me with a small, sharp blade. I fell to the ground, clutching my side as the pain radiated through my body. They stood over me, their faces twisted with satisfaction. I knew then that I was done for, that I wasn't going to make it out of this alive. But I refused to give them the satisfaction of begging for my life. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice weak. The wife knelt down beside me, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "Because it's fun," she said simply. "Because we can." The last thing I saw was the husband raising the knife above his head, and then everything went black. When the police finally found the house weeks later, it was abandoned, the couple long gone. My body was never found, just like the others before me. The house sat empty, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim, the next person who would fall into their trap. And somewhere out there, they were still playing their sick game, moving from place to place, house to house, always one step ahead. The winding roads of Woodridge had always held a certain mystique, shrouded in the dense, shadowy woods that seemed to whisper secrets to those who passed by. The town itself, nestled deep in the heart of nowhere, was a relic of a bygone era. Time had forgotten Woodridge, and in turn, the people of Woodridge had forgotten time. It was as if the entire place had been frozen in the past, with its cobblestone streets, old-fashioned lampposts, and Victorian-era homes that lined the narrow avenues. I was driving through this eerie town on a cool autumn evening, the kind where the sky is a deep gray and the leaves crunch beneath your tires. My destination was a client's mansion located on the outskirts of town, a place said to house a collection of antiques that would make even the most seasoned collector envious. The man was known for his taste in the macabre, old instruments of torture, ancient cursed artifacts, and the like. He had contacted me, knowing that I had a knack for finding rare and unusual items. As I drove through the nearly deserted streets of Woodridge, something caught my eye. A small shop on the corner of a forgotten alleyway. Its sign, hanging by a single rusted chain, read Victor's Doll Emporium in faded, almost illegible letters. The windows were dusty and clouded, revealing nothing of what lay inside. But there was something about the place, a pull that I couldn't resist. I slowed my car to a stop, parking it on the side of the street. The engine's hum died, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I stepped out, the chill in the air biting at my skin as I approached the shop. There was an odd sensation in the pit of my stomach, a mixture of curiosity and dread. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a small bell above it tinkled, announcing my entrance. The interior was dimly lit, the only source of light being a few flickering candles placed haphazardly around the room. Shelves upon shelves of dolls filled the space, each one meticulously crafted and eerily lifelike. Their glass eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. I stepped further into the shop, my eyes scanning the rows of dolls. Some were small, delicate things dressed in Victorian gowns, while others were larger, with intricate facial features that looked almost human. But all of them shared one unsettling characteristic: their eyes. There was something about those eyes that sent a chill down my spine. I was about to turn and leave when I heard a soft shuffling sound behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. An old man had appeared from the back room, his presence as sudden as it was unnerving. He was tall and thin, with white hair that fell in wisps around his gaunt face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, those eyes were a deep, penetrating blue, almost too vibrant for someone of his age. "Welcome," he said, his voice low and raspy. "You've come to see my dolls?" I was just passing by," I stammered, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. "I'm looking for something unique, an antique for a client." The old man's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Unique, you say? You've come to the right place then. Each of my creations is one of a kind. He motioned for me to follow him, and I did so reluctantly, my instincts screaming at me to leave. He led me to a small display case at the back of the shop. Inside, beneath the glass, was a single doll. It was smaller than the others, no more than a foot tall, but it was the most beautiful doll I had ever seen. Its porcelain skin was flawless, its jet black hair cascading down its back in delicate curls. It wore a dress of fine silk, and around its neck was a locket, intricately carved and glinting in the candlelight. But it was the doll's eyes that captivated me. Dark, almost black, and filled with an unsettling depth. "This," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is my finest creation. I call her Annabelle. She is more than just a doll, though. She holds a curse that binds her to those who wrong her." I stared at the doll, unable to look away. There was something about it that drew me in, something that whispered to me, urging me to take it. "A curse?" I asked, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. The old man nodded slowly. "Yes, a curse. You see, this doll was made in the image of my daughter, Annabelle. She died many years ago, taken from me before her time. I crafted this doll in her memory, but I poured too much of myself into it. My grief, my anger, my desire for revenge. Now, those who cross her path find themselves drawn into a nightmare from which they cannot escape." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but despite the warning, I couldn't resist. "I'll take it," I heard myself say, as if the words were not my own. The old man's eyes gleamed with something dark, something that made my skin crawl. "Very well," he said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "But be warned, once you take her, there is no turning back." He carefully removed the doll from the display case and placed it in a small wooden box lined with velvet. As he handed the box to me, our hands brushed, and I felt a jolt of cold shoot through my body. I quickly pulled away, clutching the box tightly. "Thank you," I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. The old man simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good luck," he said as I turned to leave. "You'll need it." I hurried out of the shop, the cold air outside feeling almost like a relief compared to the oppressive atmosphere within. As I drove away from Woodridge, the box sat on the passenger seat beside me, its presence unnerving. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake, that I had taken something I shouldn't have. The journey to my client's mansion was a blur. The roads twisted and turned through the dense forest, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. By the time I arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world into darkness. The mansion was an imposing structure, its Gothic architecture stark against the night sky. The iron gates creaked as they opened, and I drove up the long, winding driveway to the front entrance. My client, Mr. Hawthorne, was waiting for me on the steps, his tall figure silhouetted by the lights of the mansion. "Mr. Hawthorne," I called out as I stepped out of the car, the box still clutched in my hands. "I've found something truly unique for your collection." He descended the steps with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes fixed on the box in my hands. Mr. Hawthorne was a man of wealth and refinement, but there was something about him that always unsettled me. A coldness in his gaze, a detachment that made him seem more like one of his lifeless artifacts than a living, breathing person. "Let me see," he said, his voice as smooth as silk. I handed him the box, my hands trembling slightly. He opened it with the precision of someone who had handled countless delicate treasures, and as he looked upon the doll, his eyes widened in surprise. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, almost to himself. "Where did you find her?" "In a small shop in Woodridge," I replied. The doll maker said it was his finest creation, but he also warned that it was cursed. Mr. Hawthorne's lips curled into a faint smile. "A curse, you say? How intriguing. Curses are often just tales spun to add value to an object, but there's something about this doll, something almost alive." I shuddered at his words, the feeling of dread returning with full force. "Are you sure you want to keep it?" "Of course," he replied, snapping the box shut. "I wouldn't dream of parting with such a unique piece. I'll add her to my collection immediately." With that, he turned and walked into the mansion, leaving me standing in the cold night air. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was a growing sense of unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was plagued by thoughts of the doll, of those dark, haunting eyes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them staring back at me, unblinking and full of malice. The old man's words echoed in my head. "Once you take her, there is no turning back." Days passed, and I tried to push the doll from my mind, but it was no use. There was a weight that settled over me, a feeling that something terrible was coming. My client hadn't contacted me since I delivered the doll, and that only added to my anxiety. Usually, he would call to discuss the new addition to his collection, to boast about his latest acquisition. But this time, there was nothing, only silence. I finally decided to check on him. The drive to the mansion felt longer than usual, the roads darker, the trees more menacing. When I arrived, the iron gates were open, swaying slightly in the wind. A sense of foreboding settled over me as I walked up the driveway. The mansion was dark, all the lights extinguished. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant call of a crow. I tried the door, and to my surprise it swung open with a creak. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, a musty smell lingering in the air. The grand entrance hall, usually so pristine, was in disarray. Furniture was overturned and glass shards littered the floor. Something was very wrong. "Mr. Hawthorne?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. But there was no response, only the oppressive silence. I ventured further into the mansion, my footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. I finally reached the room where Mr. Hawthorne kept his collection. The door was ajar, and a dim light flickered inside. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was in shambles, just like the rest of the mansion. But it was what lay in the center of the room that sent a wave of terror through me. Mr. Hawthorne was lying on the floor, his body twisted in a grotesque position, his eyes wide open in a final expression of pure horror. And there, sitting on his chest, was the doll, Annabelle. She was no longer the pristine doll I had brought to him. Her dress was torn, her porcelain skin cracked, and her once glossy hair was now matted and tangled. But her eyes were alive, burning with a malevolent fire. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The doll's head slowly turned to face me, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. I wanted to run, to escape, but I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from those dark, evil orbs. And then, she spoke. "You took me," she whispered, her voice high-pitched and full of venom. "You took me from my home. Now you will suffer." I finally found the strength to move, turning and fleeing from the room. I ran through the mansion, my heart pounding in my chest, the walls closing in around me. I could hear her voice behind me growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape me," she hissed. "I will find you. I will make you pay." I burst out of the mansion and into the cold night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. I drove away from the mansion, the tires screeching on the gravel driveway. But even as I sped down the dark, winding roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with me, that those dark eyes were still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I never returned to Woodridge. I never spoke of what happened to anyone. But the doll's curse followed me, haunted me. Every night I dream of her, Those dark, malevolent eyes, that voice full of hatred. I can feel her presence growing stronger with each passing day, and I know that she's coming for me. There is no escape. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, she will find me. And when she does, I will face the same fate as Mr. Hawthorne, a fate I cannot escape. This is my punishment for taking what wasn't mine. This is the doll-maker's revenge. I can't say who had the idea first. Maybe it was Ryan, with his reckless smile and fearless attitude, or possibly Olivia, whose curiosity always led her into the darkest corners of the internet. It could have even been me. But what I do remember is that none of us were sober, and the idea of playing the midnight game seemed like just another thrill to pass the time on a boring Friday night. There were 4 of us in total: Ryan, Olivia, Mason, and me. We were huddled in Mason's basement, the light from our phones flickering across our faces as Olivia read the rules from a website that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. The text was pixelated, the background a sinister black, and the instructions were accompanied by unsettling images of shadowy figures and half-lit hallways. "Okay," Olivia started, her voice wavering slightly. "We need a candle, a piece of paper, something to prick our fingers with, and a wooden door." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. I'd heard of the game before, a kind of urban legend passed around at school, a ritual said to summon the Midnight Man. You were supposed to follow the rules exactly. Otherwise, the consequences were dire. People had supposedly disappeared, gone insane, or worse. But of course, no one really believed it. Ryan, with his devil-may-care attitude, was already rummaging through a drawer, pulling out a stub of a candle and a rusty nail. "Piece of cake," he grinned, tossing the nail onto the table. Olivia scribbled our names on 4 pieces of paper, her handwriting shaky. "Are we really doing this?" Mason asked, his voice betraying a note of nervousness. He was the quietest of our group, the one most likely to back out of anything remotely risky. His hesitation made me pause too, but the alcohol buzzing in my veins made it easier to shrug off the fear. "What's the worst that could happen?" Ryan retorted, his eyes glinting with mischief. "It's just a game." We gathered around the table, and the mood shifted from light-hearted to something darker, heavier. The basement's familiar shadows now seemed to twist and lengthen, and the air felt thicker, almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. Olivia handed out the pieces of paper. "You have to write your full name," she instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then prick your finger and let a drop of blood fall on the paper." I hesitated. The very idea of spilling blood, even for something as seemingly trivial as a game, felt wrong. But Ryan was already pressing the nail into his thumb, grinning as a tiny bead of blood welled up. He let it drop onto the paper, his name now stained with crimson. "Your turn," he said, pushing the nail toward me. I looked down at the piece of paper in front of me, my full name staring back. I felt a strange pull, as if the letters were somehow alive, calling to me. With a deep breath, I pressed the nail into my finger. The pain was sharp, brief, and the blood that followed was warm. I watched it pool on the paper, mingling with the ink of my name. Something about the sight made my stomach turn. One by one, we completed the ritual. Olivia went last, her hand trembling as she drew blood. She winced but didn't hesitate, her determination outweighing her fear. "Now what?" Mason asked, his voice barely steady. Olivia pointed to the clock on the wall. It was 11:55 p.m. "We have to wait until midnight, then each of us places our paper in front of a wooden door and lights the candle. After that, we knock on the door 22 times. The last knock has to be at exactly 12 a.m. Ryan smirked. Simple enough. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slowly. The basement felt colder, the silence thicker, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I could hear my own heartbeat, each thud loud and insistent in my ears. For a moment I thought about backing out, but then I saw the determination in Olivia's eyes and the recklessness in Ryan's grin. I couldn't be the only one to chicken out. Finally, the clock struck 11:59 p.m. We each took our paper, our candles, and moved to the 4 wooden doors in Mason's house. I ended up at the door leading to the basement storage room. The wood was old, the paint chipped, and I could see the marks from where Mason had kicked it open countless times when it got stuck. It felt strange, placing the paper at the threshold, knowing what was about to happen. Or more accurately, what was supposed to happen. With shaking hands, I lit the candle, the small flame flickering wildly, as if caught in an invisible wind. The door loomed in front of me, suddenly massive and imposing. I glanced at my watch, 11:59:48. I raised my hand to knock, my heart pounding in my chest. 11:59:52. My breath caught in my throat. 11:59:56. I held my breath. 11:59:59. My knuckles rapped against the wood, once, twice, again and again, until I reached the 20-second knock. 12 o'clock. The moment my knuckles connected with the door for the final knock, the candle went out. I was plunged into darkness so complete, it felt like I had been swallowed by it. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. The sudden silence was deafening, and I felt a chill so intense it seeped into my bones. "Guys?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the dark, suffocating silence. I fumbled for my phone, the screen casting a weak light that barely cut through the darkness. The door in front of me seemed to pulse as if it were alive. My hand shook as I tried to relight the candle, but the flame wouldn't catch. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight, making it hard to breathe. Then, the door creaked open. I froze. The door had been locked, I was sure of it, but now it stood ajar, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. An unnatural, almost magnetic pull drew me closer, and I had to fight with everything I had not to step forward, not to cross that threshold. A cold, inhuman whisper slithered through the darkness. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Mocking, taunting, as if it knew every dark secret I had ever buried. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick with something rotten, something that clung to my skin and filled my lungs. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that door as possible, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Then I heard the others. Ryan's voice echoed faintly from somewhere above, filled with panic. "This isn't funny, guys. Where are you?" Olivia's voice came next, barely a whisper, as if she were struggling to breathe. Something's wrong." Mason's voice was the last, and it was laced with a fear I had never heard from him before. "We need to stop this. We need to end the game." I turned, trying to locate them in the darkness, but the basement seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. My phone's light was dimming, the battery dying far too quickly. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. Then I saw them, shadowy figures just beyond the reach of the light. They were tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their faces were indistinct, shifting and melting like wax. But their eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, empty pits of darkness that seemed to devour the light. I backed away, my heart racing. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their gaze, cold and penetrating, as if they were peeling away the layers of my mind, exposing every fear, every regret. "Run!" I tried to shout, but the word came out as a strangled gasp. The shadows began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if they were savoring the terror that rolled off me in waves. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned to flee. But the basement was no longer familiar. The walls had shifted. The doors disappeared. I was trapped in a labyrinth of darkness with the shadows closing in. My phone flickered, the screen going black. I was plunged into total darkness, my breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I could hear the others now, their footsteps, their ragged breaths. But they were distant, as if the house had stretched, separating us by miles rather than rooms. I felt something cold brush against my arm, a touch so fleeting, so light, but it burned like ice. I yelped, jerking away, but the shadows were all around me now, their whispers filling my ears, drowning out my own thoughts. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched, desperately searching for a wall, a door, anything that could lead me out. My fingers brushed against wood, and I nearly cried out in relief. But when I pushed, the door didn't budge. A whisper, louder than the rest, spoke my name. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. It was so close, right behind me, and yet I couldn't turn around. Every instinct told me that if I did, if I looked at whatever was calling my name, it would be the end of me. But the pull was too strong. Slowly, as if against my will, I turned. Nothing was there, but the darkness seemed thicker, more alive, pressing in on me from all sides. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the shadows weren't just figures. They were everywhere, in everything. The walls, the floor, even the air seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the house itself was alive and hungry. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through my chest, and I doubled over, gasping. It felt like something was squeezing my heart, crushing it in a cold, unrelenting grip. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized they were coming from inside my head, echoing in my skull like 1,000 voices, all screaming at once. They were my thoughts, twisted and distorted, mocking me with every fear and doubt I'd ever had. I walked out onto the street, my heart still pounding. The houses around me were dark, the windows black and empty. There was no sound, no movement, no sign of life. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned. The people vanished without a trace. I started running, my feet pounding against the pavement, but no matter how far I went, the street never seemed to end. Every house was the same, every tree, every shadow. The world was looping, twisting in on itself, trapping me in an endless nightmare. I stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around. I was back in front of Mason's house, even though I had been running in the opposite direction. The front door was open, the darkness inside beckoning to me like an old friend. I wanted to scream, to tear my hair out, to do anything to break the cycle. But I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The game wasn't over. It would never be over. I was trapped in it, forever, a prisoner of the Midnight Man and his endless dark game. The whispers started again, soft and insistent, pulling me back towards the house, towards the darkness that awaited me inside. I couldn't resist them, couldn't fight the pull. My feet moved on their own, carrying me back to the door, back to the place where it had all begun. As I stepped into the house, the door swung shut behind me, sealing me inside. The darkness closed in, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as if they could sense my despair. And then, just as the last sliver of light disappeared, I heard a voice, my own voice, echoing from somewhere deep within the shadows. "Welcome home." "Get out!" one voice shrieked, but it was drowned out by another, more insidious one. "You'll never leave, you belong here now." I couldn't tell which voice was mine anymore. The pain in my chest was unbearable, and I fell to my knees, clutching at my shirt as if I could tear the agony out of me. But there was nothing there, no wound, no blood, just an empty, gnawing cold that spread through my veins. I don't know how long I knelt there, the shadows closing in, the whispers tearing at my sanity. It could have been minutes, hours, days. Time had lost all meaning in that place. But then, as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. I was left panting, trembling, on the cold basement floor. The darkness seemed to recede slightly, though it still pressed in on all sides, like a living thing waiting to pounce. I forced myself to stand, every muscle aching. I couldn't stay here. I had to find the others, had to get out of this nightmare. But as I stumbled through the dark, I realized that I couldn't hear them anymore. The footsteps, The voices, they were gone. The house was deathly silent, save for the faint, distant hum that I couldn't quite place. I wandered through the basement, every door I found leading to nothing but more darkness. The layout of the house had changed. Nothing was where it should be. I passed the same door multiple times, each time more worn, more decayed, as if the very act of trying to escape was causing it to rot away. Finally, I found a door that was slightly ajar, a faint light seeping through the crack. My heart leaped with hope. I didn't care what was on the other side. I just needed to get out of this suffocating darkness. I pushed the door open and stepped through. I was back in the basement, standing in front of the same door I had started with. The paper with my name on it was gone, replaced by a single word scrawled in blood-red letters. Run. I staggered back, my mind reeling. I had been going in circles. No matter what I did, I was trapped. The game wasn't just a ritual. It was a prison, and I was the one who had locked the door behind me. The light from the door flickered, then went out, plunging me back into darkness. But this time, I wasn't alone. I could feel them, the shadows, closing in. Their presence was suffocating, their whispers louder and more insistent. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was wading through thick, freezing mud, every step a battle. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, all chanting the same word, over and over like a dark mantra. Stay. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. My vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to twist and warp, the walls melting into each other like wax. I fell to my knees, my hands clawing at the ground, but it was as if I were sinking, being pulled into the floor by invisible hands. The shadows closed in, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, filling my lungs with icy breath. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was listen to the whispers, now a single terrible voice that filled my mind. You belong to us now. The darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I was gone. When I woke, I was lying on the basement floor, the candle still burning weakly beside me. The house was silent, the air heavy with the scent of wax and something faintly metallic. My head throbbed, and every inch of my body ached as if I had been crushed under a great weight. I sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in my chest. My heart was still racing, and the whispers echoed faintly in the back of my mind, like a distant memory I couldn't quite grasp. The others were gone. I searched the basement, calling out their names, but there was no sign of them. No footprints, no papers, nothing. It was as if they had never been there at all. Desperate, I stumbled up the stairs and out into the main part of the house. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling away in long yellowed strips. The windows were covered in a thick layer of grime, the light outside muted and gray. The entire house felt abandoned, like it had been empty for years. I made my way to the front door, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open easily under my hand. The air outside was cool and damp, a light drizzle falling from the overcast sky. Everything looked the same, Mason's car still parked in the driveway, the street quiet and empty. But something was wrong. The world felt different, as if it were just a little bit out of sync, like a photograph that had been developed wrong. It was the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where even the stars felt distant, swallowed up by the vast, black desert sky. I was on a late-night haul, driving my rig through the endless stretches of highway in Arizona. Nothing but barren land on either side. No cars, no signs of life, just me and the road. I should have known better. This stretch of highway had a reputation. Locals called it the Devil's Spine, because it cut through the most desolate, unforgiving part of the state. Truckers had stories about strange lights and phantom cars, but I never put much stock in those tales. The hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the road started to lull me into a trance. I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, and the only thing on the radio was static. I checked the clock. 3:18 a.m. I was making good time, but something gnawed at the back of my mind. The GPS hadn't given any detours, but I was sure I should have hit a rest stop by now. I'd driven this route a few times, but it felt like the road had somehow grown longer. I brushed it off, figuring I was just tired, and kept my eyes on the horizon. That's when I saw the lights. Up ahead, flickering in the distance like the glow of neon signs. Relief washed over me. It had to be a truck stop, maybe some old diner still open. I could use a break, and a cup of coffee wouldn't hurt either. The place was called Sam's Last Stop. A small rundown diner with a gas station attached. It looked like something out of a different era, the neon lights buzzing faintly above a half-lit sign. I pulled the rig into the gravel lot and cut the engine. The air was heavy, unnaturally still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was one other car parked in front, an old, rusted-out sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in years. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see anyone inside. As I stepped out of the truck, the silence hit me harder than before. No wind, no distant hum of crickets, just nothing. My boots crunched against the gravel as I walked toward the diner. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging on rusty hinges, and a dim light flickered inside. "Hello?" I called, but my voice sounded strange, muted, like the air itself was swallowing my words. No response. I stepped inside. The diner was empty, but it looked like it had been abandoned mid-service. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the tables, cups of coffee still full but stone cold. The place was frozen in time, like everyone had just left. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked linoleum floor. I walked up to the counter and rang the bell. The sound echoed unnaturally, loud in the stillness. Behind the counter, an old radio sat, playing soft music. It was an old country song, something I hadn't heard in years. The static mixed with the melody, giving it an eerie, otherworldly sound. Then I heard it, a shuffle of feet, slow and deliberate, coming from the back room. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, tall and gaunt, wearing a dirty apron over an old plaid shirt. His eyes were sunken, and his face looked as though it hadn't smiled in years. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with a blank expression. "You need gas?" he finally asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, trying to shake the unease that crept up my spine. "Yeah, and maybe a cup of coffee if you've got it." He didn't respond, just turned and walked to the back of the diner. I sat at the counter, my eyes darting around the room. Something felt wrong, like the place wasn't supposed to exist, like I had stumbled into some forgotten corner of reality. Minutes passed, and the man hadn't returned. The coffee machine behind the counter sputtered to life, but no one was there to start it. I stood up, my nerves on edge, and called out again. That's when I noticed the photos on the wall. They were old, black and white, showing various truckers and travelers standing outside the diner. One photo in particular caught my eye, a group of men standing in front of a semi, all smiles. But something was wrong. The truck in the photo, it looked like mine. I stepped closer, squinting at the faded image. The license plate, there was no mistaking it. It was my truck. A chill shot through me, and I backed away from the wall. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could that photo be there? How could my truck be in a picture from decades ago? I turned to leave, but the door wasn't there. The entrance, the one I had come through, was gone, replaced by a blank, unmarked wall. My breath quickened as I scanned the room, looking for another way out. The lights flickered, and that's when I saw him again. The man from the back room was standing in the corner, half hidden in the shadows. His eyes were locked on me, and a slow, twisted smile spread across his face. "You're not the first," he said, his voice a low rasp. "And you won't be the last." I backed away, my hands trembling. "What is this place?" The man didn't answer. He just stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The walls of the diner seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, heavier. The radio crackled with static, the music warping and distorting into an unsettling hum. I turned and ran, bolting toward the back door. It led to the kitchen, a small, grimy room filled with rusted appliances and the stench of rot. The exit door was there, but as I reached for it, I heard voices, low, whispering voices, coming from every direction. I slammed the door open and stumbled outside, gasping for air. The gravel crunched under my boots as I ran toward my truck, the cold night air stinging my lungs. I climbed into the cab and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. The diner's neon sign flickered in the rearview mirror as I peeled out of the lot, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I drove for what felt like hours, but the road never seemed to end. The desert stretched out in every direction, but I couldn't find my way back to the main highway. The GPS was frozen, stuck on a blank screen, and my phone had no signal. The lights of the diner flickered in the distance again. I'd been driving in circles. And then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him, sitting in the back seat. The man from the diner, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark, his voice a whisper in the wind. "You never really left." I floored the gas, but deep down, I knew. I was never getting out.